Welcome, everyone, to the IAS Educational Fund webinar entitled Making PrEP Accessible, Updates on Long-Acting Injectable Options. I am Renata Arrington-Sanders, and I will be moderating this session. I'm an associate professor of adolescent medicine, pediatrics, and internal medicine at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. And my expertise really centers around adolescents and young adults, particularly caring for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender youth, as well as youth that are at risk and living with HIV. I serve on the International AIDS Society Governing Council, as well as serve as the medical director for our pediatric and adolescent HIV program, and direct the pediatric and adolescent transgender and gender expansive services at our Children's Center. The purpose of the International AIDS Society is to really galvanize the scientific response, build global solidarity, and enhance human dignity for all those who are living with and affected by HIV. And really the mission is to convene leading minds to accelerate scientific discovery. We advocate for evidence-based and stigma-free policies and educate change makers to ensure the global response of HIV follows the science and puts people first. And so with this in mind, we've brought together for you a webinar to provide the latest updates on long-acting injectable PrEP, including the latest science, the research emerging from recent conferences, such as the results from HPTN 083 and 084. Participants will also hear about what's going on the ground from a civil society perspective and the evolving PrEP landscape, as well as how to move policy forward. I'd like to do some housekeeping before we actually start. I will be introducing our speakers. Please note there are a number of attendees and all participants are currently muted. We'll have planned time at the end for questions and answers. And so please hold your questions to the end of the question and answer period. If you do have a question, you can feel free to put it into the chat. You'll notice there is a thumbs up symbol when someone will ask a question in the QA box. If you have similar questions or find this question important, please click on the thumbs up sign to help us prioritize this question. In case you're having any challenges with Zoom, you can find additional guidance provided in the chat box. Please also send us technical questions that you may have in the chat box as well. And feel free to let us know which country you are from and where you're connecting so that we can see how we're interacting and where we're coming from. We would also like to thank our donors, ViiV Healthcare and Gilead Sciences. And then I'll tell you about the agenda. Here are our wonderful speakers for this morning. Dr. Beatrice Grinstein is our International AIDS Society President-elect, and she'll be really bringing the science around the HPTN 083 and 084 data. Sunil Solomon is a professor of medicine at Johns Hopkins University and will really bring the science around CROI and some of the newest data that's been released. Shakira Namawanje is from the Ugandan network of AIDS service organizations, and she'll be providing an on-the-ground experience. And Mitchell Warren is the executive director of AVAC and also an IAS governing council member, which will really speak to how do we move forward in this area. It's with pleasure I have the chance to introduce our president-elect, Beatrice Grinstein, who will be really talking about the 084 and 083 data. She is an infectious disease physician, researcher who has dedicated her life to the care of individuals that are at risk and living with HIV. She has focused on HIV and AIDS care and research. She established the Fiocruz HIV/AIDS service, which is the largest care provider and houses the first established trans health clinic in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. She is the director of the HIV Clinical Trials Unit of Fiocruz in Rio de Janeiro, and has just contributed to advancing the science on HIV prevention and treatment. She serves as the co-chair of the HPTN 083 study to evaluate injectable cabotegravir PrEP in HIV-negative men who have sex with men and transgender women. Without further ado, Beatrice, welcome.
Hello, good morning, good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you are. I'm just trying to share my screen. Are you seeing my screen now? Can you see my screen?
Yes.
I'm sorry. So thank you so much, Renata, for the beautiful introductions, and thanks for the opportunity to participate in this great webinar. I see lots of people joining. We will start talking about injectable CAB-LA, a potent strand transfer integrase inhibitor that was evaluated for HIV prevention among different populations. So just to remind you about our study designs, 2 large randomized controlled trials have demonstrated the effectiveness of injectable CAB when compared to oral TDF-FTC PrEP, the HIV prevention trials networks, 083 and 084. So 083 was a double-blind, double-dummy randomized controlled trial, which assesses the effectiveness of CAB-LA for PrEP compared to oral TDF-FTC among 4,500 participants in the US, South America, Asia, and South Africa, and showed a 66% reduction in new infections in the cabotegravir arm when compared to active TDF-FTC. And importantly, this study was conducted among MSM and transgender women in all these regions. With a similar design, HPTN 084 observed an impressive 89% reduction in new infections in the CAB-LA arm compared to the TDF-FTC arm among cisgender women, mostly young women in African countries. Both studies are ongoing and in an open label extension phase. Moving to the efficacy results more in depth, just to remind people of the efficacy analysis that we have done so far. So this is the aggregate of the blinded and the follow-up 1-year unblinded data of HPTN 083 to start with. Overall, we have had 25 incident infections in the cabotegravir arm. Again, this is a combination of the blinded and unblinded period, and 72 infections in the TDF-FTC arm. You can see the incidence rate listed right below those numbers. On the right, you can see the hazard ratio with the 66% reduction in incident HIV in the CAB participants compared to the TDF-FTC arm. And here is the data for HPTN 084, exactly to the blinded and 1-year unblinded period. Similarly, HPTN 084 observed impressive reductions of HIV infections in the CAB-LA arm compared to the TDF-FTC group. What you can see is that there was 89 fewer infections in the cabotegravir group, showing the superiority of cabotegravir over TDF-FTC in preventing HIV among cisgender women. So, long-acting cabotegravir is very effective in preventing HIV among MSM, transgender women, and cisgender women. As we said, with a 66% reduction in HIV infection among MSM and trans, and an 89% reduction among cisgender women, both when compared to TDF-FTC. We did examine specific subgroups in both studies, and the magnitude and direction of the effectiveness of cabotegravir in HPTN 083 was preserved among populations who have historically experienced greater adherence challenges with TDF-FTC PrEP, including youth, Transgender women, we had an impressive 12% enrollment of transgender women, the largest enrollment in transgender women in any clinical trial done so far for PrEP, and also 50% enrollment of US Black participants. Those were metrics that were put together prior to the study initiation. In this slide, you can see the subgroup analysis performed in HPTN 084, showing no difference in efficacy by age. This has been particularly important in individuals assigned female at birth, because with our modalities of PrEP, we have seen lower efficacy traditionally because of adherence challenges in younger age groups, and we haven't seen that with cabotegravir LA. Differences by contraceptive methods were also looked at, and no difference by subgroup was seen. Also, no differences in efficacy was seen regarding body mass index. So long-acting CAB is very effective in preventing HIV among young individuals, Black individuals, transgender women, individuals from various regions of the world, individuals using various contraceptive methods, and individuals with higher BMIs. Now, moving a bit to the safety aspects, I will focus on the most important adverse event that was seen, that was the injection site reactions. They were the most frequent adverse event in HPTN 083. You can see in this slide that about 80% of the HPTN 083 trial participants in the CAB arm referred an injection site reaction. Mostly of these reactions were mild to moderate, but also 30% of people reported injection site reactions in the TDF-FTC arm where they were receiving a placebo injection. Over time, you can observe that the reporting of those injection site reactions went down, and only 2% of people actually discontinued injection due to this side effect. In HPTN 084, 21% participants, so much less proportion of participants, had any injection site reactions, and no discontinuations whatsoever were observed due to injection site reactions in HPTN 084. So long-acting CAB was safe and well tolerated. The most common side effect was injection site reaction, majority of them mild to moderate in severity. The reports of these injection site reactions decreased over time, and very few of them led to the discontinuation of CAB-LA. And now we will move to the few failures that were seen and some of the HIV testing challenges. Data are still being collected on the safety. Another important thing that I wanted to say is that data is still being collected on the safety of cabotegravir during pregnancy and breastfeeding. And this is very important. But to date, data does not suggest at all that there are any safety concerns. So moving now to the failures and HIV testing challenges. So as a long-acting drug, CAB-LA can make HIV diagnosis challenging if HIV infection is not diagnosed before CAB-LA is actually injected, as CAB-LA suppresses viral replication and delays antibody production. So a failure to diagnose HIV infection prior to the injection can lead to continued CAB administration and even continued CAB infection without the proper detection of HIV infection. There are concerns over possible risks of integrase inhibitor drug resistance with the use of CAB-LA due to the initiation in primary HIV infection in different moments, such as primary HIV infections, that meaning that you inject without knowing that person is already infection, maybe during the eclipse phase when no antibodies are present and you can't detect infection through an HIV rapid test. Infection breakthroughs that are an important point that we will talk a bit more about while on CAB-LA, and infections during the CAB-LA tail. So breakthrough infections are actually very rare, but they remain unexplained. HPTN-083 now reports a total of six cases of breakthrough infections, despite on-time injections, all of them with integrase resistance. So 6 cases in the entire HPTN-083, among the entire number of HPTN-083 people who received the CAB injection, CAB-LA injection. HPTN-084 identified very few incident infections, and no true breakthrough cases were identified. Very importantly, no integrase resistance was detected in any of the HIV infections in HPTN-084. One important thing is the pharmacological tail of injectable cabotegravir that was often cited as an additional concern for cabotegravir rollout. As we have seen in the phase 2 HPTN-077 study, 13% of cisgender male and 42% of cisgender female had detectable CAB concentrations over 76 weeks following the last injection. Reassuringly, in HPTN-083 and 084, there was no evidence of integrase resistance in any of the individuals who were diagnosed with an HIV infection during the tail phase. Of note, results from a very elegant mathematical model of rapid scale-up of PrEP and nearly complete switch to CAB-LA in sub-Saharan Africa, developed by Andrew Phillip and his group, suggested that CAB-LA would result in a 20% reduction in HIV incidence and reductions in the number of people living with HIV, but will result in an increase in the absolute number of people living with integrase-resistant HIV. However, and most importantly, despite this, CAB-LA was predicted to lead to a decrease in HIV-related mortality. Surveillance to integrase-resistant and subsequent response to integrase-based ART should be performed during CAB-LA rollout to further inform policy. So just now, a very few words on implementation. Historically, the introduction of evidence-based technologies into public health programs has been fraught with delays that result in missed opportunities for impact. Expanding HIV prevention options need to be done while expanding PrEP coverage, ensuring that the introduction of new PrEP modalities increases access and reduces disparities in PrEP uptake, rather than simply providing alternatives for individuals already engaged in PrEP. The rapid development of implementation science to guide the large-scale adoption of long-acting injectable PrEP will be vitally important to understand the outstanding issues and implementation approaches for populations who urgently need effective prevention choices. And just to finalize, it's never enough to reiterate that inequalities are a major driver of the HIV epidemic, which continues to disproportionately burden vulnerable populations despite the availability of effective preventive and therapeutic interventions. Our current models of HIV prevention delivery are not responding to the needs of these populations. Stigma and discrimination remain as significant roadblocks. The interplay of the different forms of discriminations go far beyond homophobia and transphobia to include race, ethnicity, and social class. All these forms of discriminations, coupled with HIV-related stigma, significantly hinder access to health services. The most vulnerable populations struggling with poverty and social inequalities are the ones that suffer the most from HIV. May long-acting PrEP does not deepen the already profound inequalities. On the contrary, may it be a step forward in our effort against inequalities. Thank you very much.
Obrigada. Thank you. That was wonderful. So our next speaker is Dr. Sunil Solomon, who's a professor of medicine in the Division of Infectious Disease at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine. He completed his medical training in India and received a master's in public health and doctorate in epidemiology at the Johns Hopkins University Bloomberg School of Public Health. Dr. Solomon has been elected into Phi Beta Kappa and Delta Omega Honor Society. His research is primarily focused on epidemiology, prevention, clinical management, and access to care for HIV, viral hepatitis, and other infectious diseases in vulnerable populations, including people who use substances and men who have sex with other men. Without further ado, Dr. Solomon.
Thank you, Renata, for that kind introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're logging in from. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about what we knew before CROI, how much our knowledge is advanced since CROI, and what the gaps are still in terms of translating this extremely efficacious tool into something that's effective and makes a difference, like all the models have shown. So these are my disclosures. So let's start with what we know, and thank you, Beatrice, for giving that great introduction. I think most of what we know in terms of efficacy comes from the HPTN 083 and 084. So we know that long-acting cabotegravir, even before CROI, reduces incidence of HIV compared to FTDF in cisgender women, cisgender men who have sex with men, and trans women at risk of HIV from sexual intercourse. And like I mentioned, and Beatrice has already walked us through this, it primarily from the efficacy range somewhere between 66 and 88% in HPTN 083 and 084. So what we really learned from CROI was there was a sub-analysis of the Black MSM and TG in the US. So you can see on the slide that was presented by Hyman Scott. There were 15 infections in the FTDF arm among the Black MSM and TG in the US, and 4 infections. So it was extremely efficacious. In fact, the hazard ratio point estimate is even more efficacious in this group, though the confidence intervals do overlap. We also learned from Sybil Hosek, who presented a sub-analysis of HPTN 084, which was looking at 55 adolescent and young girls under the age of 18 from 3 different African countries, that CAB-LA for HIV PrEP was safe, it was tolerable and acceptable to sexually active adolescent females. So I want to come to the first gap in data. So I do a lot of work with people who inject drugs, and so it's some sort of bias towards this, but to me, this is probably the biggest gap. So we know HPTN 083 and 084 recruited about 8,000 participants between 2017 and 2019. So this was the number of new infections at the same time in a cohort of 782 people who inject drugs in New Delhi. So it's almost 1.5 times and 1/8 the population, and yet we have no phase 3 trials among people who inject drugs. In fact, if you think back for the past 10 years, I'm guessing none of us will be able to come up with any trial looked at reducing, whether it's a U is equal to U or PrEP, among people who inject drugs. And what is even worse is most studies, including HPTN 083, and has an exclusion criteria which says illicit intravenous drugs within the 90 days before enrollment. So I know I'm presenting data from New Delhi, but and people who inject drugs account for about 1 in 5 new infections outside of sub-Saharan Africa. But this is not just the low and middle income country setting. Like in the US, we're in the midst of one of the worst opioid crises we've ever seen, with overdose deaths claiming more American lives every day. And this is a pattern we're seeing happening in multiple parts across the world. And similarly, we're also seeing small outbreaks of HIV happening among people who inject drugs in places where we previously never saw them, like in West Virginia or in Lawrence and Lowell County in Massachusetts. So I think if we really are serious about ending the HIV epidemic, we really have to be more inclusive. And I'm glad Beatrice brought up this issue of stigma, discrimination, and equity, because we need to start including people who inject drugs in every trial we do. And I would actually, my dream would be to see inclusion of people who inject drugs in all these trials, and a sub-analysis similar to what we do for gender and race, also stratified by substance use status, because we really need to know at the same time, is this product also going to work in people who inject drugs? Are there any complications that we need to be aware of as this is going forward? With that being said, I think there are other populations we don't really need efficacy data because they fall into one of the other subsets. But I think we should remember these populations as we scale up long-acting PrEP. It's people who are incarcerated, especially at the time of release. Long-acting PrEP has an extremely valuable role to play when they are trying to figure out where they're going to go to their primary provider, and similarly, people with unstable housing. So establishing efficacy really is the first step. And so another caveat that we knew before CROI was it was efficacious in people who are willing to be enrolled in a trial of long-acting CAB. So by default, these participants were already interested in long-acting cabotegravir, which brings us to the new question of acceptability. So in CROI, we saw a sub-analysis of the 803 US participants who were in the open label extension in both arms, because it was a double-blinded trial. It was people in both arms were given an option to choose between long-acting injectable CAB versus oral FTDF. And as you can see here, almost 96% of the participants preferred the long-acting CAB, and only 4% wanted the oral FTDF. And the majority of the 70% of the people who picked the long-acting CAB said they preferred injections and did not like pills, versus people who were enrolled in a trial of long-acting CAB, over half of them said they preferred the oral because they did not like injections. So this is something that we're going to have to think about as we plan our scale up, because what we really don't know is where do these 083 participants fit into our target population globally. If it's a perfect fit like what it is on the slide, nothing to worry about. It's going to be great in terms of scaling up. But the reality is it's probably going to be somewhere in between, because there is data from multiple ethnographic studies that have been conducted globally, which clearly shows that people do have preferences. Some people still prefer oral, and some people definitely want injectable. So as we think about scaling up, I think what we need to start thinking about is how do we measure acceptability? And I think this was really missing from CROI, but I'm hoping to see a lot more of this going forward. Most of the times we ask them questions like, would you be willing to take an injection to prevent HIV? But I think we know a lot more in terms of long-acting cabotegravir itself. So how does that acceptability get affected if there's a high probability you will have an injection site reaction, but it'll resolve in about 3 days? I think as Beatrice showed, almost 80% of participants in 083 and about 25% in 084 had those injection site reactions. Most of us, it may not be a big deal, but for some people, that may be a huge deal, right? And then similarly, the PK tail is something we still are evaluating. So what happens if you need to take oral tablets for a year after you stop? So it's sort of like counterintuitive. We're telling people who don't want to take an oral tablet, you can take the injectable, but once you stop, we'll have to keep taking the oral tablet for almost a year after. So again, the utility of this period in terms of like breakthrough infections, especially with resistance, I think there's a little bit of data coming out. It's probably not going to be a big deal, but I think we need to understand this a little bit better. And as Beatrice also presented, there is a possibility that you might still get infected, right? So that's something else that we need to communicate as we're measuring acceptability globally. And most importantly, we also have to understand acceptability from a provider perspective, because in low and middle income countries where the healthcare systems are just overburdened, do they have the capacity to start giving injections if people start coming in, versus oral PrEP, which can be couriered to people's houses or can be home delivered? And once we have acceptability, I think the other caveat that we knew before CROI was they had to visit one of the D8's clinical research sites globally, and CROI did not really add much in terms of delivery, because we are moving to this whole community-based models and community-led models, versus this is almost taking a step backwards and saying you have to come into a facility. So as we move forward, and I think especially going forward with generic licensing of long-acting CAB, we can expect a lot more delivery strategies. So some ideas I want to throw out is probably like field-based and home-based delivery of long-acting cabotegravir, similar to what is being done for antiretroviral therapy, or trying to deliver it from mobile clinics, like what they can do in Los Angeles as part of a HPTN trial that's ongoing. And also the idea of like a self-injectable is really building upon what we have learned from the self-injectable contraception, which is really being scaled up across sub-Saharan Africa. Is this something that we could also look at? And the last thing I want to think about is also like, could we actually deliver this from like Walgreens, the chemist stores, like from every street corner, similar to what we did for like Moderna and all these and Pfizer vaccines for COVID. So these are just some models I want to throw out there, and something that we should be considering. And I'm hoping to see a lot more data on these models in CROI 2024, 2025, and beyond. And I guess the elephant in the room is cost, right? So whether a long-acting CAB is cost effective or not really depends on what the pricing is compared to generic FTDF. So I'm not an expert, but I'm going to try and walk you through a little bit of how you need to think about this. And I think Michelle is going to talk a lot more about this in the access section. So if you think of any program, they have a fixed amount of money, and that money needs to be distributed between PrEP, ART, HIV testing, education, and everything, right? So this was like a simulation that they did among extremely high-risk individuals in the US. And you can see that even at year 10, if you rolled out FPDF, the cost a program would incur is still lower than the current cost of long-acting cabotegravir in the US. And for it to be cost effective, the price would need to drop somewhere to about $3,500 to $7,000 per year, depending on what people are willing to pay. And if you went to a low and middle income country setting, it would need to be somewhere between $9 and $14 for it to actually be cost saving for a program. Because I think you need to think about this from a programmatic perspective, because if the program, because our budgets are sort of flat these years, and so if you are putting money into long-acting cabotegravir, you need to pull money out of something else. So I think it's very critical, but at the same time, I think it's also important to think about it from a pharmaceutical perspective, because there needs to be return on investment so they can get some money back, so we can see a CAP 2.0 or a CAP 3.0 or newer versions of long-acting PrEP in the pipelines. The other thing I think Beatrice mentioned was also about the integrase inhibitor. So this was the study by Philip, the Smith in Lancet 2023 by Phillips's group. And so you can see that we will see an increase in INSTI resistance. So if we see what they projected, which is about 12% in 2070, I really don't think it's a big deal. But there are bounds on this confidence interval. And so we end up seeing somewhere around 15 or 25% by 2028, then it's a completely different issue that we would need to consider going forward. So this is something else that we would need to closely monitor as we roll forward. The other thing I want to point out is most of the models, most of us now are only thinking about long-acting CAB versus oral FPDF, but there are other options. Like in CROI, it was clear that the pivirine ring is a intervention that we are overlooking. For women who actually want the dapivirine ring, this may actually be just as efficacious as long-acting CAB or oral FPDF. And then what about emergency or event-driven PrEP? Like we really know that adherence and duration of use drive what efficacy is. And I know this is not a long-acting CAB, but I think this elegant study that was presented by Jeannie Marazzo at CROI is extremely important for us to look at. So they looked at about 6,000 women, out of which 3,000 had objective and subjective adherence measures. And what they really saw was both objective and subjective adherence dropped over time with oral FPDF. And you essentially ended up with 4 groups of people: the people who are consistently daily taking their PrEP, the people who are consistently low, who are never taking their PrEP, the people who are consistently high, and then you had this other group who started off high and declining. So if you are looking at long-acting cabotegravir, I think the 2 groups below, the high but declining and the consistently low, those are populations where long-acting cabotegravir may have a role. Again, because I think most importantly is like people who are consistently taking oral PrEP daily, you are not going to see any infections. And the important caveat from both 083 and 084 is if you did a per protocol analysis and restricted it only to people who have therapeutic levels of drugs, there was absolutely no difference between the 2 arms. So it really comes down to an issue of adherence and compliance. And that is what I think we need to think about is, yes, there's long-acting cabotegravir and there's oral, but we don't need to give everybody one or everybody the other, but trying to understand which population this is going to have the most benefit will give us like a pathway to scaling up long-acting CAB. The other theme that was extremely prominent at CROI was the whole dynamic choice. There were 2 excellent presentations by Kakandhya and Kamya, which I would encourage you to look at. It's not necessarily long-acting PrEP, but it does show you the role of choice. And it showed that it almost resulted in a doubling or a 35% absolute percentage increase in prevention service coverage if you gave people the choice. And then we have all these other things also happening. So I don't think it's a question of long-acting CAB versus oral FPDF, but it's more a question of like, how do we figure out which prevention strategy works for which person? And the only thing I want to also point out here is we're only talking about prevention here, but remember that treatment as prevention is probably the most efficacious prevention tool. So think about this in the context of scaling up antiretroviral therapy, because if we can get almost everyone suppressed, then the cost effectiveness and the return on investment and the need for prevention services is going to change. right? Because the risk of transmission and the risk of acquisition is going to start going down. So it's important to think of long-acting cabotegravir in the context of everything else that people do have access to. And I just want to end by saying, but don't just stop at prevention, because we really need to see where long-acting cabotegravir fits into the whole person-centered care that we are transitioning towards. Because we know more today that social structural determinants of health, like depression, sexual violence, unemployment, those really are the factors that are driving risks that are placing people at risk of acquisition of HIV. So if you actually manage to come up with solutions for those, maybe we won't need these prevention services and people will be happier. So I think we really need to understand, where does long-acting PrEP fit into this whole person-centric approach that includes social structural determinants, diagnostic, pharmacotherapy, harm reduction, and not just among some populations, but I think about all populations, whether it's gay men in the US or people who inject drugs in India or heterosexual women in sub-Saharan Africa. We really need to understand, where does this fit in? I want to end by thanking people who take part in research studies globally, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sunil. That was wonderful. Really, really set us up for a wonderful discussion later on this morning, afternoon, wherever you are. Our next speaker is Shakira Namawanje, who is the Policy and Research Advocacy Officer at the Ugandan Network of AIDS Service Organizations. With over 6 years of HIV and sexual reproductive health and rights advocacy, specializing in HIV prevention and research advocacy, advocacy for cure research, as well as sexual reproductive rights. With the emphasis on young people. Shakira uses the experience coupled with music, dance, and drama to educate and engage young people and key stakeholders. She is recently awarded the HIV Leader of the Year 2022 by the Ministry of Health, Uganda. Welcome, Shakira.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you for having me. I come to you representing the African Women's HIV Prevention Accountability Board. And my topic today is to roughly talk about the landscape of, the landscape of HIV, the landscape of PrEP and how far we've come. Speaking of PrEP, we all know we started from oral PrEP, which was approved back in 2012. And speaking of my country, we only got to fully adopt oral PrEP in 2017. And up to now, I know there is a lot of information that people don't know about oral PrEP, even though it has been in our midst for years now. And since then, we've seen like a range of products come on board, which is now the, in simple terms, as I speak for young people, we say the PrEP injection or the PrEP ring, which is the DVR, the dapivine vaginal ring, or the PrEP injection, which is commonly known as Kabele. So this shows that we have come a long way when it comes to HIV prevention. And these tools have now come on board, even though some of them are not yet accessible in our communities, like oral injection, like the PrEP injection and the DVR that I've been mentioning. And also this shows that there are a range of other products on the way that we hope will one day be part of the basket when it comes to HIV prevention. And some of these include the MPTs. We have seen research on the implant, which is something to do with HIV prevention as well. So this shows that the landscape is changing from what we've seen in the early years, from where we are now, the products that are being introduced, and where we are going, the products that are still in research. And we are hopeful that one day, or with time, we will be able to access these products. So how can we engage young people in HIV prevention? one of the many ways in which we can engage young people in HIV prevention is we need to put young people in their diversity at the center and forefront of this response. And speaking of young people's diversity, we all know what is happening in my country in terms of key populations, signing of the homosexuality bill. So we all know what is happening. I won't say much about it, but we all know if we are to lead the response, we need to put young people at the center in their diversities, at the forefront of the response, while investing in an agenda that prioritizes human rights, especially for young women and key populations. And also, if we are to engage young people in HIV prevention, we need to scale up interventions targeting young people and addressing stigma, discrimination, and criminalization. If we do not tackle these issues, then I will say we are washing and hanging in the dirt at the same time. We also need to ensure that young people are engaged in research and not just engaged in the sense that we come and tell them about the research and then go away. No, we need to periodically inform young people about the research. We need to allow young people participate in the research, and this includes the pediatrics, the young babies, such that we can have this information or data to support them access these products. And also, we need to do periodic and ongoing information. We need to be part of the ongoing research from the onset, design, right to the introduction of the products as they come on board. The other thing is cost. If we are developing products that are highly expensive, then young people will not be able to access them. And as well, if young people cannot access them, then I will say we're not doing what we're supposed to do in order to engage young people. So we need to bring down the costs of these new interventions, the wonderful interventions that are coming on board. We need to make sure that their prices are not so high, such that young people can be able to access them. We need to meet young people where they are at, and that is that we need to think around how do we deliver these products in areas where young people are more comfortable living in society or in situations where there is criminalization, there is discrimination. We need to make sure that the programs or the delivery methods of these products meet young people where they are at in order for them to access them. We need to do integration of HIV prevention into existing information and service packages like SRHR, such that young people get a holistic package. One young person cannot come to the health center today to seek HIV prevention and then come back the next day to seek SRHR information. We need to make sure that these packages are integrated together such that a young person accesses a holistic package. Then the other thing which is really, really important is choice. We need to give young people a range of products to choose from. We need to allow young people, we need to trust young people to make the decisions that are for their own bodies. And for them to make these informed decisions, we need to equip them with information. We need to educate them such that in the end, they can make an informed choice for what product really works for them in terms of HIV prevention. Excuse me. And the other thing is the current options that we have are really good, but they're not enough. We need to invest more in research that allows and develops additional systemic and non-systemic products such that we have a range of products to choose from. Then the other last comment is, as the African Women's Accountability Board, we are working on developing the Choice Manifesto. And this manifesto is in its final stages. So we are calling upon people out there that would really, really want to join or sign the manifesto. And it will be launched really, really soon. And this shows that if we are talking about young people, if we are talking about HIV prevention, we need to prioritize choice. And to do that, we need, like I said, a basket of options, a range of products for young people to choose from in order for them to be safe, and we need to trust young people. We need to end stigma and discrimination among the different categories of young people or people generally. We need to stop discrimination. We need to stop criminalizing people for who they are. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Shakira. That was wonderful. And thank you for making sure we're reminded about choice and the importance of choice. Our next speaker is Mitchell Warren, who has spent nearly 30 years devoted to expanding access to HIV prevention. He comments that he's had the great fortune in work with a wide range of activists and advocates and researchers, scientists, product developers, and deliverers, policymakers, and community boards around the globe. And since 2004, Mitchell has been the executive director of AVAC, an international non-governmental organization that works to accelerate the ethical development and global delivery of HIV prevention options as part of comprehensive and integrated pathway to global health equity. He is currently the co-chair of the Global HIV Prevention Coalition, a member of PEPFAR Scientific Advisory Board, and president of the TB Alliance Stakeholder Association. He is also a member with me on the IAS Governing Council. Without further ado, Mitchell.
Renata, thank you so much. What you didn't say is I'm also the president of the Shakira fan club, and I feel like I should just cancel my slides and say what she said. And Beatrice and Anil and Sunil and Shakira all covered so much, and I'm privileged to kind of stand on their shoulders and give you a sense of how we actually might go faster. And I'll try to do this relatively quickly so we can get to the great conversations that are in the chat. And for some reason, although I'm using my keyboard, I'm not. Oh, there we go. A couple of very quick updates. Again, you've heard a lot of this already. It's actually a remarkable day to be having this call. You'll see toward the bottom, and you heard earlier, today was the very important announcement from the medicines patent pool of 3 generic sublicenses. Oh, now the screen's catching up with me. Let me go back a bit. Very sorry. So these 3 licenses from the medicines patent pool really set out now for us the challenge of how to make sure over the next 3 to 5 years, we build a sustainable market for PrEP as a category, oral PrEP, the vaginal ring, as Shakira said, and injectable cabotegravir that can support these multiple products, these multiple manufacturers. And we have a track record of not doing that particularly well. So the challenge is great, but the opportunity and the need is even greater. You can see now 3 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have approved cabotegravir for PrEP with, importantly, labels that are quite permissive, thanks to the amazing data that Beatrice presented related to 083 and 084 that allows, I think, for quite permissive labeling and the programs to really provide it to broad age ranges, to a wide range of people. 8 implementation science projects have been approved, and I'll show you those in a moment. PEPFAR has now, just in the last couple of weeks in their country operating plan activities, highlighted 6 countries for immediate opportunities to get cabotegravir. The Global Fund and the Children's Investment Fund Foundation are investing in 6 additional countries with PrEP scale-up. But in the short term, we have this limited availability from ViiV, the innovator of the drug, while they try to build their own capacity with additional manufacturing capacity, and then now with 3 generics. And I'll talk also finally about this coalition trying to bring together a range of stakeholders to have us all move faster together. I did want to start, and this is actually where Shakira really focused and said it so beautifully, but we often have these 2 parallel universes. Very often programs and policymakers and even providers might look to people who are at risk, and how do I find them and how do I give them these prevention options? And what we really need to do is be more human-centered, user-centered, person-centered in recognizing what people want. And it's often not about HIV prevention. It is about relationships. It's about their own sexuality. And eventually we want to give them exactly what Shakira so beautifully highlighted. We want choices in products and choices from programs as well. So how do we do that? Because we don't have a great track record, at least in prevention. This is a map showing you from the Global PrEP Tracker on PrEPWatch.org, global PrEP uptake now 12 years since we first knew it was safe and effective. And while we might look and say 3.8 million initiations is good, we have so far from the target set to have reached 3 million users by 2020. And I will just highlight that initiating on oral PrEP or even on cabotegravir does not make you a PrEP user necessarily. So we have missed the target terribly. Again, we want to make sure, I think as a collective, I hope all of us on this call, all of us related in the AIDS community, irrespective of our constituencies, want to go faster in the next couple of years than we've done in the last decade with oral PrEP. So how might we do that? Clearly, there are enormously important lessons, and there's a link, and it'll be in the slides that get posted, lessons from the oral PrEP programs and their implications. This gives you a snapshot that in the first several years of oral PrEP, we had what I often call random acts of goodness, a number of terrific programs and projects in 68 countries, 54 stakeholders running different programs, but not tightly coordinated, not helping to answer the critical questions to help inform policymakers, funders, and communities to make decisions. So what's a different way of looking at this? How do we make sure that we're answering decision maker questions in parallel with the clinical trials as they began years ago? How do we ensure that there's a shared strategy, shared by donors, shared by communities, shared by civil society to ensure that injectable cabotegravir for PrEP goes faster? And not because CAB in and of itself is the perfect product, no product is. But again, to Shakira's point, how do we make sure that as future products come our way, that we have a roadmap, a playbook, a way of working that allows us to seamlessly add in these new products? We now have the ring and injectable PrEP, and we don't have the seamlessness to introduce those as we should a decade into oral PrEP. This is from a plan that AVAC published about a year ago on how to accelerate access across a bunch of different domains. And you can see from the product itself through regulatory approval, planning and budgeting, programming, and most importantly, uptake and continued use, key milestones that really needed to be met. The good news is there's some progress. So a year ago, we said that ViiV needed to license injectable CAB to the medicines patent pool. It came later than we all would have liked, but it did come in July. And then it talked about making sure generic manufacturers would then be licensed and then get the resources to make this product. And again, just today, the 3 companies were announced. So I'm not going to go through this slide in detail. This is from a year ago, and we are now working through this new coalition that I'll describe to chart the progress, to ensure that this work is happening with scale and with equity to actually get us to ultimate impact. And I will just highlight that cross-cutting line, and I guess you'd call it some shade of purple about stakeholder engagement, the essential need to integrate and engage civil society throughout the process, not because they might be potential users, but because civil society can engage and support everything from product development through to regulatory approval, through to getting this product procured and programmed. So in July, a coalition came together that is elegantly called the Coalition to Accelerate Access to Long-Acting PrEP. I want to highlight that this is not about injectable cabotegravir for PrEP. This is about building pathways for long-acting PrEP, the products we have, vaginal ring and injectable PrEP, and future technologies. As many on the line will know, there is a next generation injectable called lenacapavir that's currently in large phase 3 efficacy trials, results expected in the next couple of years. The hope is that this coalition and this way of working might help us do better faster, not only with lenacapavir, but any products, antiretrovirals for PrEP, or antibodies, or eventually a vaccine to go more quickly. It is convened by UNITAID, WHO, UNAIDS, Global Fund, and PEPFAR. AVAC is acting as the secretariat for the coalition. And the current structure, which is currently being assessed to make sure that it's fit for purpose, are these 4 working groups. And I won't get into the details, but the idea is to really work towards a shared strategy. Very importantly, in orange on the side, you see 4 critical enabling factors here. The IP and voluntary licensing that MPP worked on with ViiV and that again was announced today. Implementation science, the robust set of programs that are now beginning to get designed and beginning to enter into the field. civil society engagement that has got to come across all of the working groups and throughout the coalition. And there's a civil society caucus now that brings together a number of civil society actors, including the African Women's Prevention Community Advisory Board that Shakira mentioned, as well as AfroCab, a key population advisory group, really working globally to bring civil society into this conversation, and then donors as well. And you can see with that orange star that much of this coalition is looking across the board at a range of products. This, I realize, it has some small font. It is a graphic that comes from our newsletter, PX Wire, a quarterly update on all things prevention. This just gives you a sense of cabotegravir and dapivirine ring, about the regulatory status, as well as where the clinical trials took place, highlighting when oral PrEP got approved, what initiations were like in 2022, and what cumulatively has happened since the product was launched. And this really sets the benchmark. And I think for all of us, how do we get to these, actually surpass these numbers more quickly than a decade? And then again, you can see where there are global fund matching funds available for PrEP. In green, countries that PEPFAR has identified as initial recipients for cabotegravir through the PEPFAR process, and then the implementation science programs, the 8 studies that have been approved in that column that's shaded, and then additional projects in design. So it's a very active landscape, but we need to pull together collectively to make sure that the promise that was seen in 083 and 084, as Beatrice presented, the safety and efficacy that was so strong can actually be adapted and amplified and scaled up in actual programmatic settings. There are now a number of projects that have been designed, as you saw on the previous slide, but I wanted to highlight, while 27 may seem a lot, you can see that things don't happen as quickly as they need to. We only have 3 of those countries in sub-Saharan Africa having approved the product. Other regulatory agencies are still reviewing applications. There are internal approvals at ViiV that take time, and we need to speed that up. The product supply, making sure the product actually reaches the participants in these programs, and then making sure that whatever comes out of these studies is actually addressed in building out our policies and our future larger scale programs. But I wanted to flag where we have challenges. And again, I think Sunil described this beautifully in his presentation. We have a number of programs, but you can see where people are left behind. And particularly at the very bottom, people who use drugs who are not right now explicitly included in any of the current programs. You can also see that these programs are all very small. All of those programs, only 4 of them have over 5,000 participants. If we really want to show that we can have impact and that we can get prevention right with this range of new products, we have got to go to scale much more quickly. And much will depend not only on these studies, but on the ability to supply that product, knowing that at least over the next 3 years, we are dependent on the supplies from ViiV, the innovator company, while the generic manufacturers, the 3 companies announced today, can begin to scale up. So we've got our work cut out for us. How do we translate these options into real choices? How do we understand testing? Again, you heard earlier, ensuring civil society engagement throughout all of these processes. Provider training is going to be critical. We talk a lot about wanting to simplify PrEP over the last several years, and now we have a product that does require a higher degree of intervention. It's an injection, a relatively large injection in the buttocks. So, we've got to think about this, but not only on the clinical side, it's also about training providers in counseling support, and most of all, I think, in empathy, in making sure that they are partners with the individuals who come to see them, not gatekeepers. And we need to set realistic targets of what we can accomplish. We need to identify what the product can solve for and what it can't. Many of our fundamental challenges, and again, Shakira described it so eloquently, this injection, I wish it could solve our human rights challenges. It can't. And we have to recognize what a product can overcome and what it can solve for and what it can't, and what we have to work on systematically and culturally and socially to help these products. And most of all, we have got to do better. We have got to do better with the vaginal ring and injectable PrEP than we did with oral PrEP or with COVID vaccines. All 4 of these are technologies that get people excited, that look good in clinical trials. But if we don't do it with equity, better than we did with oral PrEP and COVID vaccines, that all we have done is elegant science. We have not made a difference in this epidemic. And none of us, I think, are here for interesting science alone. We're here to make that science apply to people's lives and to have impact. So I want to thank everybody. Renata, thank you so much for bringing us all together, some resources here, and I'm delighted to turn it back to you.
Thank you, Mitchell. And we're going to open it up for questions. And I just ask that all the speakers just turn their cameras back on. Before we get into questions, just some housekeeping. Yes, we'll be sharing the recordings of this, and the slides will be shared via recordings on the IS website. So please look for that there. So thank you. This was wonderful. Beatrice, I wanted to go back to you. I think there have been a number of questions, particularly around the data that you had presented with the rollout of the 083 and 084 data, particularly around INSTI resistance and the long tail. And some of the questions were really centered around thinking about accessibility and convincing local government policy, et cetera, moving forward, given that this is the case, and how to address that, as well as how to then transition individuals that might actually have been on cabotegravir for prevention who may seroconvert, thinking about other options in the future, and how do you address those dynamics?
So can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the great question. So I will start talking a bit about the testing and the integrase resistance risk. So I think that from a programmatic and country perspective, it's critically important that programs and countries select a testing strategy and algorithm that promotes access to CAB among those who will most benefit of it, and not that these strategies or algorithms works against the potential user. So while the inclusion of a molecular test might prevent a small number of cases of drug resistance, just to bring back the information, there are few cases of drug resistance. The feasibility of this strategy needs to be very carefully considered. So to add on the regular testing models that are in place in the countries may actually delay the implementation of CAB-LA. And we just need to think that this needs to be very well planned, not to put this extra monitoring against the potential user. So requiring molecular HIV testing will delay PrEP initiation, may introduce a complex lab-based algorithm and decision-making to establish HIV infection, will significantly increase costs, will increase delivery complexity, and fewer people at the very end will likely access CAB. So I think it's very important for us to look at the implementation studies that will hopefully start soon, as Mitchell showed some of those, and look at the strategies that will be used in those projects to inform us how better to move forward with true rollout, and to do surveillance of integrase resistance, and to closely monitor the subsequent response to INSTI-based antiretroviral therapy. And this should be done during PrEP rollout to further inform policy. About the other question, I think that as Shakira said, the most important thing is to acknowledge that the best person to define, the most important thing is for the person to have the choice. So I think that the choice concept is central to this conversation. Having said that, I think that there is this big risk, as we always have when we introduce a new technology, that those who are more aware, who have more resources, end up using it before those who can actually benefit from them. So we don't need to expand PrEP options for those who are already doing very well with oral PrEP. We do need to get to those who are not doing well on oral PrEP and bring to these people a new prevention option that can better fit to their lifestyle. So I don't know if you want me to go into further detail on any specific aspect, so I am available here to anything.
Thank you, Beatrice. That's and I think you're spot on. I'm going to turn to you, Sunil, just for a second. I think that you really highlighted this intersection between marginalized communities, particularly people that may inject drugs or may use substances, people who are incarcerated, people that are often overlooked, unstably housed. Someone in the chat mentioned trans men, for example. Mitchell, you mentioned trans men, sex workers that are often criminalized in their countries, right? There's a lot of stigma around those communities, right? So how do we address getting this medication to those people within countries where the act of being and existing is criminalized and they're already marginalized? And also, how do we address that with the lens that often I'm a provider, and we've been rolling out Cabenuva, right? Cabotegravir with rilpivirine, and there's a hesitancy to give individuals injections unless we know that they're going to come back, especially with that long tail. So 2 questions, twofold. Maybe you can answer that, Sunil.
Sure. Thanks, Renata. I think those are both extremely simple questions to answer. But I think the way we actually make it happen is through people like Mitchell, Shakira, and Beatrice. Like, they've been leaders in this field, and so their continued advocacy is what is going to make this happen globally, right? But that being said, I just want to point out that homosexuality, Section 377, is still a crime in several countries globally, right? And it took like advocacy and policy years and decades to make it happen. So that being said, there is precedent for policy being changed. And I think Michelle can definitely give us the how-to guide on how you actually make that happen. And I think that's, and people brought it up in the question as well, we're in 2023. I think people have choices. And I think the one thing we do is we judge people. Oh, he is a drug user, right? Without understanding why is he or she using drugs, right? And in most cases, it's the unemployment, it's depression, it's like things where society has failed them that's driving them to drug use. Right. So, and if we can actually fix those things in society, we won't be worrying about people who inject. We won't be worrying about HIV prevention because people will probably not be engaging in risk as much. Right. So I think it's that which gets really tricky. And in terms of adherence, it does get challenging. I think that's where all the implementation studies pan out, because like Beatrice mentioned in her slides, there were breakthrough infections in the US where we saw in-state resistance, but in the US we have access to protease inhibitors and everything else. They still were suppressed. All of them were suppressed, even though they had breakthrough infections with in-state resistance. I think the challenge is as we go internationally, where there's also a lot of exposure to NNRTIs before, and if they get in-state resistance, then they have 2-class resistance. And the NNRTI resistance gets archived, what actually happens there, what are the alternatives? And then the beauty of like generic manufacturing is we combine combinations. So for example, we have TLD, which is tenofovir, lamivudine, and dolutegravir, or TLE, which is tenofovir, lamivudine, and efavirenz, but we don't have a similar combination for protease inhibitors. So if we need to switch to protease inhibitors in LMIC settings, it may end up being 2 or 3 drugs, which may affect adherence, because obviously 1 pill once a day is the dream all of us are striving towards. So I think it's something that we would need to look closely. I think as 083 and 084 get more data, especially 084 as they roll out, I think, and if we see infections and breakthrough infection, then that's the same thing with the PK tail. Yes, we have it in the trials that we need to give that extra year of coverage with oral FPDF, but we really don't know how many infections are going to happen. And are they coming with in-state resistance? Because if an infection happens, it's different from if you're getting an infection with INSTI resistance, right? So I think looking at that, because infection with INSTI resistance is what I would be really worried about if it affects your your subsequent response to PLD, because of the way drug procurement happens globally, because PEPFAR and other governments, they just buy one regimen. So we start seeing a lot of breakthrough infections with INSTI resistance. That's where we need to start getting concerned. But if we see infections happen when people get off oral of a long-acting cabotegravir, I think that's something where we need to figure out, like, why are these infections happening? Because we clearly haven't addressed their risk. So I'm hoping I sort of addressed the two questions.
Well, so Mitchell, it sounds like you're going to be able to solve the intersecting access that exists within countries or lack thereof, and stigma and criminalization. So maybe you could respond to how do we get it on the ground? I think that there's it's wonderful to hear that there may be a generic that may help with cost, but I think Sunil mentioned from the CROI data, acceptability doesn't equal accessibility, right? So how do we really get it to those youth and the key populations around the world, those people that need it most?
Yeah, let me just pull out my magic wand over here. Thanks a lot, Sunil. It's the essential question. I think one of the things we can do, in all honesty, is stop the fixation on products. As excited as we are about cabotegravir, as excited as I still am about oral PrEP and the depivirine vaginal ring, I'm still excited about condoms. As excited as we are about these technologies, they don't prevent infections if they don't get used. And I think we really need, and it sounds so simplistic, but I see this over and over again, donors and policymakers and product developers themselves rightly put their hearts and souls into these activities. And it's wonderful. We need it. We want it. It's not enough. The R&D products that don't get delivered with equity and with scale don't really matter. And there's I don't have the fix for any of it. And I think, Renata, you know that. I will refer everybody to what I think was one of the most brilliant articles I've read in such a long time. Barney Graham, who's been a long-time HIV vaccine researcher, who, as many of you will know, became a leading COVID vaccine researcher and really is the co-developer of the Moderna, called the Moderna, but it's actually the NIH, Moderna mRNA vaccine, wrote an article in the New York Times this last Sunday. I'll put the link in the chat, that really highlighted this, that we've got to address all of these issues: stigma, criminalization, mistrust. And if we don't, we can keep doing R&D and we will just see infections continue to not only plateau, but potentially rise. And I don't mean to say this in a negative fashion. I think the message in all of this is, let's design programs differently from March 30th, 2023, that integrate these products into well-designed rights-based programs. And I realize that's easy to say, great rhetoric. We've got to start doing it. And we've got to hold funders to account for that. If it's just a procurement exercise, we're just going to see cabotegravir in warehouses along with condoms. We've got to actually design real rights-based programming that is people-centered, that leads with empathy as well as equity.
Beatrice, I see you have your hand raised and you wanted to say something.
Yes,
and then I'm going to come to you, Shakira.
It's just one word after Sunil's observation about resistance. I just don't want us to leave this webinar with the sense that we will face an epidemic of integrase resistance. This is not the case. We need to frame it properly, that there were very few breakthrough infections. We still don't know the mechanism that these infections happen. They bring integrase inhibitor resistance, but they are really very few breakthrough infections. The other big fear was the infections during the tail phase. We are not seeing infections during the tail phase that bring integrase resistance. So we need to calm down, see how best, as Mitchell is saying, how best we can integrate this product and other products to come, that the new products to come we will also face testing issues because they are long-acting products. So we are just starting to deal with the new phase of prevention that we will learn a lot from now on, but we need to be calm and don't panic with this resistance issue, because the modeling data shows that even if resistance increases, and it may increase integrase resistance, we still have a survival benefit with CAB. And CAB is the drug that will first be implemented, hopefully. Thank you.
Thank you, Beatrice. Shakira, so I want to go back to you because I think, Mitchell's charge that was just given is critical, right? People first charge, right? And you talked a lot about, choice. And also you talked about integrated packages and reaching youth. And so I'm an adolescent provider. That's what I do. And it's hard to reach youth. Even when we have something that's available, sometimes not every youth wants it, right? And so how do we reshape it? What's your experience that you can share that will help the people that are here listening? How do we engage youth and communities to increase that access, but to really want to help them to see that this is really a people first approach that they can actually have choices in what they want to do from their sexual health and their reproductive rights?
Oh, yes, thank you. If we are to reach young people or to have them access these services, like I said, we need to stop criminalizing young people for who they are. This puts them into hiding and stops them from accessing the products. Already we know that even with the previous landscape or political, whatever we're going through down here, young people still didn't want to go to the hospital. They didn't want to go to health facilities to get these services. So there are centers that they are comfortable in, like drop-in centers, safe spaces. We need to think around how to get the products to places where young people feel comfortable to express themselves and comfortable to access the products. And also where we're packaging our information about these products, we need to be very careful not to, let's say, hype one product over the other or sell one product over the other. We need to show young people these are all prevention options and young people choose which one works for them. And we also have to keep in mind that young people change their minds anytime. So I might want the deprivin ring today and might not want it tomorrow. I might want the injection today and not want it tomorrow. So there should be clear information that young people understand. So we need to design our information in ways that young people understand. The music, the poems, the animations, anything that relates to them that they can easily pick the information from, we need to do that in order for them to understand. And also we need to trust young people that they can be in charge of their own bodies and make their own decisions in order for them to access the products. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so I think you raise so many important points, particularly around young people, but people in general, right? We often want to control what people do and how they do it when we need to give people their own control. I appreciate the choice, and I was envisioning sort of this, buffet style of different options. Mitchell, I'm going to go back to you for a second because with MPP, I'm excited, but the reality is that I haven't seen drug companies working together. Okay, so how are we going to do this so that when I'm talking to my youth or I'm talking to my adult that is at risk for HIV, that I can give them the buffet of options and there's not one or the other that's being, as Shakira just talked about, push for more, and it's seamless.
Well, and the buffet of options right now is available to everyone who has a subscription to New England Journal of Medicine, where you can read the phase 3 results of the oral PrEP trials, the Ring studies, and the CAB studies, and the Lancet too. And I don't mean that as a joke. We have to do in real life what we do in science. We run the clinical trials elegantly and beautifully, and Beatrice and her team and the 084 team spectacular. It gets published. We need a seamlessness, a handover, a handoff. We often say, ending HIV is not a sprint, it's a marathon. And it's not even a marathon. This is a relay race. And we don't have the systems to have that baton passing from the investigators to the implementers with support from companies, generics and innovators. And that is, in a sense, what this coalition is trying to do, not for cabotegravir alone, but for the field as a global good. There's a need to create a baton system. And we actually do have that in the treatment space. When the world shifted to dolutegravir, there were systems in place. Even if the health system isn't perfect everywhere, and it clearly isn't in my country, when you make decisions, the procurement lines change, the health systems are there, it's a new drug. We don't have that in prevention. And so what we really need to do, and I think this is when I talk about setting targets, it's not just how many people get access to CAB. For me, the target for us that we will be judged as a community on is, have we built the relay team that can do now better than we did with oral PrEP, do it with lenacapavir, do it with comes next. And that means working with the innovators. And the challenge is, how quickly can these 3 generics get us product? And where can they get it? And how cheap can it go? We don't know. All we know is, and licenses are a step in the right direction, but they don't make access. They don't even make product. Licenses open up a pathway. And we need to now pave that pathway in a way that we have never done before. So you're right, Renata, we don't have a clear way to do this. And we've got to stop making it up every time. We've got to start being systematic and strategic in this. And one of the targets is making sure that within the next 3 to 5 years, there are multiple suppliers with much lower costs. But we also have to build a market that all those suppliers can compete for. Oh, and I was just going to say, and you should really ask someone at the medicines patent pool. And I just saw the video pop up.
Yes, so I'm going to turn it over to Sebastian Morin, who's from MPP. Go ahead.
Yes,
Sebastian.
hi everyone. So this is really a big day for LA PrEP with this really important webinar and the announcement we made earlier this morning. So I'd like to just cover a couple of points around the license between MPP and VIV Healthcare for CAB-LA for PrEP. So we announced that license last summer at the AIDS conference. The license is for CAB-LA for PrEP. It covers 90 countries. So there's all the least developed countries, low-income countries, lower middle-income countries, as well as all countries in sub-Saharan Africa. There's also some language in the license that allows, or let's say does not prevent companies, licensees to supply countries where there might not be any patent right. So we know that language is working. We've had that in the DTG license, or the license for the dolutegravir, where we've seen so far more than 120 countries accessing the product. So there's similar language in the CAB-LA license. Now, we've announced earlier today, not the license, but the sub-licenses, and that means, giving the permission that was granted by VIV to generic manufacturers. We've selected 3 of them. There was a process that was very comprehensive, with including a very long set of questions that are technical, but also about the footprint of companies, their plans for the specific product. And this process was blinded. And at the end, when we had a short list of the best companies, there was also an audit in person, which was also blinded in terms of the communication to the selection committee. So we selected 3 companies. These are Aurobindo, Cipla, and Viatris. Viatris will work to its subsidiary Mylan. They are all India-based companies, but Cipla will also have manufacturing in South Africa. The number of 3 companies is trying to strike a balance between having sustainable business, so making sure that companies will be able to manufacture and stay in the market over the long term, but also having sufficient competition. And we certainly want all of the companies to succeed in that process. So there will be some support to the companies. So some of this is being discussed as part of the LA PrEP coalition that Mitchell was talking about, but there's also commitments from MPP and VIV to accompany the companies as they move forward. MPP will also be doing the usual license management that we do. So this is basically saying that, you know, the license is not the end of the process, it's the start of the process. So after that, we will be in touch on a weekly basis or sometimes daily basis with those companies around their different plans, the hurdles they might face, and so on. We will be pushing them as usual in terms of giving them intel on the competition so they know that where the others are, so they can step up their game and be faster and get an edge and get to market more rapidly. We've seen that for DTG, the timeline between a license being agreed and the product on the market was 3 years. So we know that this can be quick. We know it can be much quicker. You know, we've seen that in COVID. In less than 1 year, there were products on the market for MPP licensed generics. But of course, this is a more complex product. So the exact timeline is something that we'll have to see, but there's a lot of organizations and people making sure that there's support to move that forward. As part of that, there's also support being discussed to reduce the risk of companies and support them such that the development costs are managed in a way that doesn't impact negatively the price at the end. So we don't know yet what the price might be. It's still too early for that, and the license is not prescriptive on that. There's it's all about competition and about also the procurement agencies that will be able to negotiate across these three companies. Of course, a big prerequisite for the lower price will be the demand and the economies of scale. And so for success, we have to think big, we have to have ambitious plans, and we have to have them right from today, because this will send a strong signal to companies that they can scale up, and then the cost per person or per patient years of use will be much lower. And just to finish, I'd just like to mention that as usual, our licenses and sub-licenses are fully published on our website. The press release is available in French, Spanish, and English. We are looking into translating into other languages as well. And we look forward to continue in this project with a lot of the stakeholders in the LA PrEP Coalition, but also much more broadly over the couple next years.
Thank you, Sebastian. We only have a few minutes left on the panel, so maybe just each speaker can share one final word. I'd like to start with Beatrice.
So first of all, I would like to thank to the IAS for putting together this webinar, and to Renata for this wonderful coordination of the process, and for all the speakers. I particularly loved to know Shakira, and to hear her was very inspiring to me. So I think that also the news about MPP and the 3 factories selected were big news for us today, very timely. And I just wanted to hope that we can have other webinars to increase knowledge about these new prevention strategies, and see how best we can implement these strategies for those most at need. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Beatrice. Sunil.
Thank you again for the opportunity to present here with this panel that's like superstar. And I think I just want to reaffirm what Beatrice said. Like, I completely agree with her that persistence is not an issue that we should be thinking about that's going to affect the scale up, but it's just something we monitor because we have enough data to say it's good. The only other thing I would say is, as we think about scale up, choice and moving from a disease focus to a person-centered focus, trying to understand how that happens is going to be critical. And I am also extremely excited to hear that 3 Indian generics are going to be making long-acting cabotegravir, and I'm hoping India is on that list, because the last time I checked, it wasn't. But if India is on our list, that's going to be huge for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunil. Shakira.
Oh, yes. Thank you so much for having me. I will say this, and maybe on behalf of the African Women's Prevention Accountability Board, the fight to end new infections among young people, mostly adolescent girls and young women, for me and for them, is a personal fight. And we need to continue to do our best. And Yes, thank you for having me, and I hope we get these products in the hands of the people that actually need them in time. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakira, and thank you for your wonderful words. Mitchell.
I'll add my thanks. I want to add one thing to what Sunil said. Not only is it 3 Indian companies, but one of them, Cipla, has committed to work with MPP to include manufacturing in their South African facility. It would be the first time PrEP, injectable PrEP made in Africa. And I think that's hugely important. There are huge challenges of this product. There are huge challenges of manufacturing, huge challenges of all the human rights issues that we've all talked about. And that can be really depressing. There are huge opportunities to do something we have never done before. And I hope we all leave this call sober, knowing that it's going to be a heavy lift, and there's so much to do. But we've never had an opportunity to reimagine HIV prevention as we have sitting here in 2023. Let's do it. This is our best opportunity in 42 years. Let's not squander it.
Excellent words, excellent final words, Mitchell. And thank you to each of the presenters. This was a wonderful session to moderate, to organize, and I appreciate each of you for your expertise and for being here today. Thank you to all the participants for attending and just being active and actively involved in the discussion. There was a lot of discussion in the chat. We will be sending out a evaluation survey just as far as how you attended the webinar, what you got out, and whether or not this was very helpful to you. It's really important that we have feedback from as far as the IAS educational funds, because we really seek to create these webinars that really address the needs of the population that we are serving. Thank you again for everyone participating in this webinar, which has now come to an end. The recording will be shared again on the IAS website soon, and we are open to hearing more, and please be on the lookout for other IAS Educational Fund initiatives and webinars. There will be an upcoming update on innovations around treatment and prevention of HIV and tuberculosis and co-infections. So please look for this link. It was put in the chat earlier, and we just hope that you have a wonderful day wherever you are around the world. And let's end HIV together. Thank you.